Hello, welcome back to Philosophy Roulette 170. I had some technical difficulties and I kept going for like a good 5 minutes after realizing my internet had dropped out. I think it might be the humidity. It's why it's so dark. It's raining here, and once in a while that will mess up my connection. Okay, so where were we? Over here, which is really too bad because I kept going. Now I don't remember what I said, but it won't be my first time reading it, so maybe I'll be smarter this time. Photographs writing with light are working at multiple levels of visibility and invisibility, both making their subjects overly visible, especially when dealing with black bodies, exposing them to colonial gaze so as to highlight bodily differences, and also making utterly spectral in the sense of their transformation into mere images in the minds of colonizers and the colonized that have internalized colonialist practices. While this medium was particularly enlisted in operations of racialized othering and is understood by critics as a key to their racialization, such a racialization, as Lugonis importantly reminds us, is connected to the coloniality of gender. It is thus key to examine gendered spectral operations within what, following Deborah Poole, we can regard as a visual economy dominated by different layers of power in the creation, dissemination, and the context of images. In order to follow a particular thread within the spectral operations of photography, let's consider an example that engages the important colonial gender-race-sex nexus that decolonial feminism calls us to pay attention to, critique, and ultimately resist. Consider so-called hidden mother portraits that were part of Victorian photographic sensibility, portraits that created ghosts out of not only of mothers but of nannies who were not fit to be represented in the photograph. Alright, so this is like the nice kicker. I mean, you come down to this and look at this picture. So, I don't know how well it's going to come through, but basically, we've got a mother or nanny hidden by drapery holding a child here. This is why I like to do things fresh. It's you would have got my honest reaction to this. I was like, oh my god, that's crazy picture. But now I'm like, you don't get that sort of initial hit the second time through. Anywho, okay. Yes, I'd made comments already. It is interesting that these photographs are called hidden mother portraits, and the person whose collection and book made that the genre more well known, Linda Frigny-Nagler, states that the mothers seem to have been aiming to create an intimate bond between the child and the viewer rather than between themselves and the child. The desire to create a bond between the child and the viewer may be one of the reasons for the veiling. Another reason might well be that 19th century photographic processes required that the subject sit a long time, and thus there was the need for someone to hold and appease the baby or child being photographed. However, it is also important to consider a decolonial feminist reading of these photographs informed by the gender-race-sex nexus within what Lugonis calls the light and dark sides of the coloniality of gender. I suggest that doing so is part of the process of carrying the decolonial feminism that Lugonis is calling for, and that requires that we pay attention to the colonial construction of gender dichotomies that continue to inform present understandings of gender. Such a construction is not a product of discursive norms. Rather, it is connected to practices of perception as such, of aesthesis that become pivotal in the construction of colonial imaginaries. What I was saying here, there's lines here already. I mean, there's a question of you had to sit for a long time for one of these photographs, but I mean, you can see that the child's hands blurred, so they probably moved their hands at a certain point. It's much more blurred than this child's clothing. But why would that affect the adult? Wouldn't the adult then be able to sit? You'd assume the adult could sit still for however long it was. So, and even then, you'd see shift in the drapery if the adult really couldn't move. So the technical requirements of sitting still doesn't seem like it makes sense that's why you'd cover the person up. I don't understand that. That's what I was saying over here. But yeah, because I mean, the kid, you can see the foot, is blurry. The distinctions on the hands are gone because the kid obviously was moving their hands. Okay. For Lugonis, the ultimate task of decolonial feminism is the praxical task to create the possibility of overcoming the colonial gender that entails a critique of racialized colonial and capitalist heterosexuality gender oppression as a lived transformation of the social. I engage the Victorian hidden mother photograph as an important example of the spectral perceptual practices of coloniality within the photographic medium. A reading of such photographs is animated by way of Lugono's understanding of the light and dark side of coloniality of gender as explained above, the light side referring to the gender impositions of bourgeois white women that are considered passive, as well as the ones responsible for continuing the white race, and dark referring to those impositions connected to colonized dark bodies who are thought as violent and animalistic, and thus devoid of gender. Here, even whiteness is subjected to spectral operations. First, let us consider beings behind the veils, literally made invisible as mothers, if they are the mothers, but visible not as the ectoplasm that constitutes a specter, but as a lump, a cloaked protrusion that is supposed to be ignored by the viewer, a shrouding operation of invisibility that makes more visible the status of the mother as less than the child, a mere image that only becomes incarnate in her reproductive function as the bearer of the white child, a ghostly subjectivity indeed, in a double sense of her literal negation from the photograph, as well as her getting an identity that is dependent on the white male gaze it needs. All this is an example of boomerang perception, which the white woman, the colonizer's wife, is doomed to carry somebody else's agenda and to exist merely as an image, in the sense of being imagined as the ideal mother who erases herself for her child. I should also note that I am not aware of any hidden father photos, the division of labor within the modern colonial system and its later appropriation being quite explicit about gender roles within the family unit. I have a small aside here. Being just north of New York City, if you know the story of the Headless Horseman, that literally was written and takes place just like a few miles that way. New York City is just like a few miles that way. I'm right in between that area right now. So that is one type of a literally headless person. So this reminded me of that. Yeah, so like Washington Irving lived right over there, like just a few miles over there, and so I'm just north of New York City right now, and so it's like, this is sort of, I was just wondering like how they do these sorts of things. I'm sure they put like a green screen, so like a modern day version of this. You could like wear one of those green screen face masks, and so you could make yourself headless. Of course, there was a Invisible Man movie remade a few years ago. Of course, a long time ago too, but that was mentioned above, I believe. So, okay. While it is the case that there are indeed various explanations for the production of these hidden mother photographs, it is in the context of decolonial feminism what they signal is not trivial. They stand as a powerful indication of the status of the white bourgeois woman as a type of non-being, or rather a being who matters insofar as it can hold the precious white child who is the prize of the nation, and not just hold him but give birth to him in order to uphold the familial bourgeois unit. Her subjectivity does not matter, her womb does. She becomes literally spectral while a sheet covers her, and she becomes a ghostly silhouette that is almost comical were it not discussing the way in which her subjectivity becomes appropriated for the service of a system of production relying on the different labor of various bodies, some deemed more respectable but still undermined for the sake of the colonial system, and others completely abject so as to exploit their labor, turned into ghostly subjectivities that, while ghostly, could still be shackled and terrorized and made part of the brutality of slavery and other forms of subjection. It is this spectral operation that creates blackness as non-being and does violence to black bodies, but that, following Christina Sharp, can be held in the wake so as to understand the insistence and largeness of black life, despite its many negations. We must look into the dark side of coloniality of gender and follow its other, more brutal side. While the spectral perceptions of coloniality within the context of photography are such that they are carried out by way of chemical processes capturing the dance of light on paper and metal, and thus they are not directly piercing, cutting, smashing flesh, they are nevertheless implicated in the rationalizations, the pseudo-scientific explanations that led the colonial enterprise to excuse and perpetuate its viciousness and domination of so-called deviant and dark bodies. I guess the comment I was making here is that the chemical process is, of course, not a innocent one. I mean, you're just obviously most of us have depth perception, and usually this sort of photographs are not three-dimensional things. Of course, we nowadays have 3D stuff, but even then, all these processes do remove something from the like life image, the actual life, and so none of those things should be viewed innocently, because they're all making concessions of one way or another, and so they're not directly piercing, but they are flattening, they are moving things closer and farther away. You can see this sometimes when especially in like I heard once, you have these like nature shows, and so sometimes they try to drum up sort of like fights within like just the animals, but a lot of this stuff is of course tricks of photography, making two animals look like they're fighting when they're really farther away from each other, or other things like that. So it's like all these things can, they even though it's a chemical process, that chemical process is in no way, shape, or form innocent or objective. In the context of the hidden mother photograph, it is important to note that it is probably the case that in many instances, those strange, mysterious mounds and bulges in the photographs are concealing not mothers but servants whose image needs to be erased given their racialization. Here I must be clear that my point is not that the dark servant is always erased from the photographic record of the family, as there are many photographs depicting children with their nannies of color, all showing different levels of representation of the nanny. But I wish to think with Beatriz Gonzalez-Stephen and Carl Good's work that examines how photography is a producer of the subject that organizes specific relations between knowledge, power, and the languages of the body. They write in the context of 19th century Venezuela and discuss the residues of coloniality in 19th century Latin America. They explain the way in which visiting cards allowed for making one's body visible as part of the liberal project of the modern nation. And most importantly, for the purposes of this article, they comment on the so-called hidden mother photographs, which they rightly call hidden nanny photographs, and state, portraits in which servants were portrayed only when cloaked by blankets allegorized the complex contradictions and disruptions in the political unconscious of a social class engaged in constructing its symbolic representation. The cloaked figure is not only masked this class's own racial anxieties in posing as almost white subjects, but also shrouded the dark side of the modernity they were buying into, the reproduction of the Republic's coloniality. It was a class that desired to appear self-sufficient, which is why the portrait is individual, when in reality it was sustained by the laboring body of a slave or freed slave, with whom the class in question both needed and feared. In the case of photographs of the English Photographic Archive, they state, this archive showed little shame in emphasizing the covered bodies of nannies or nurses likely brought back from the colonies of the empire, whether from the Caribbean or India. The racial violence of these English photographs is not one that desires to make the trace of the erasure disappear. So in the colonies, I guess, maybe they were trying to show independence, but the English themselves, they didn't care. They were just like, oh yeah, we've got these people from other places. The comment that the English photographs have a racial violence that does not wish to make the trace of the erasure disappear interests me. It points to a crucial aspect of the process of making ghosts or spectral or phantasmic operations that requires the process of making invisible be made visible so as to solidify and legitimize the subjectivity of the colonial gaze. That is, it is by the very spectral operation of turning a being into an image that the colonial gaze asserts itself as the gaze to which all other gazes must return, and the gaze through which all others must be seen, including white women in the light side of the coloniality of gender. But the process is only to be visible as a trace, yet another specter within the spectral process of making the other, be it a woman or colonized being, into a mere image. The haunting, then, the dwelling with ghosts that I propose as necessary practice of decolonial feminism entails learning to see and feel anew. Following Avery F. Gordon, this haunting has as its task a conjuring up the appearances of something that is absent. To do so under decolonial feminism is to recognize the wound of the colonial difference, not just in terms of understanding how such a difference informs past gender arrangements and understandings, but also presents ones what Gonzalez-Stephen and Good call residues of coloniality and to understand them as part of the complex operations of perceptions, including the visuality connected to photographic technologies. Returning to Gordon's important words so they themselves do not melt in the air, we need to remember that the ghost represents a loss, a path not taken, but also future possibility. We are in relation to it, she states, and it has designs on us so that we must reckon with it graciously, attempting to offer it a hospitable memory out of concern for justice. And we must pay attention to Lugones' important words. I want to see the multiplicity in the fracture of the locus, both the enactment of the coloniality of gender and the resistant response from a subaltern sense of self, of the social, of the self in relation, of the cosmos, all grounded in peopled memory. Without the tense multiplicity, we see only either the coloniality of gender as accomplishment or a freezing of memory as ossified understanding of self in relation to a pre-colonial sense of the social. Part of what I see is tense movement, people moving, the tension between dehumanizing and paralysis of the coloniality of being and the creative activity of being with the being, like some sort of being. For Lugones, then, the task becomes a practical decolonial feminism that not only discloses the operations that led to the coloniality of gender, but also allows for the possibility of resistance from the very point of the colonial wound, whose very woundedness does not preclude a new type of creative being that may open up ways of destabilizing colonial gender impositions. As we have seen, such impositions are the result of not just of discursive techniques, but of the very perceptual practices of colonization that are implicated in spectrum making and desouling for the purposes of coloniality and empire. To enact a decolonial feminism entails following the traces of these spectral operations that contribute not simply the raw elements, but also the very foundation of the perceptual architecture of colonization that turns living flesh into abject spectrality that emanates like rays of light from the surface of photographs. Okie dokie. So, my technical difficulties aside, this was a really kind of interesting paper because it's taking these it's taking the technology of in this case photography, but just technology in general as sort of the method of oppression here. So by using the technology as a way to show off the colonial relationship, it in some sense it discounts the subjectivity and the agency of the colonized, or it could either be the gender or like the subjected group. So in this case, you've got both the nannies, who are probably people of color, or just the women, maybe even the mothers, as gender oppression on that case. But or it could be both, of course. But yeah, so you've got these ways of making like this person here, you always see the ghost as like someone in the drapery, and you gotta wonder that is this sort of part and parcel of it. And so that is kind of where the concept of this paper seems to or at least it obviously pulls in the modern context of like the ghost under a sheet is sort of like this woman under a sheet holding this baby here. So, and how that actually operates on the consciousness of the people who are producing these things and the viewer, of course. So, and the question is how heavy-handed is. I mean, this talked about ghosts and spectrality. I mean, it's a little. I mean, as far as philosophy goes, this sort of you're free to use the metaphors as you want, and it's an interesting way to go, just to sort of go all in on calling people ghosts. I mean, actually, in the context of this paper, it's fine. It's just, I guess my biggest criticism might be it's a bit of a loaded word, and maybe in terms of philosophy, using loaded concepts and words like that can be a little difficult because, again, people are going to come with a lot of baggage associated with that, and if you're trying to make a specific point, that makes it hard. In this case, I don't think it was really a problem because the author here was pretty specific about what was going on. Is that the technological imposition of of how to view the people actually made a big difference in how they are viewed, and that the sort of objective understanding of photography really doesn't is not objective at all, and it was used to employ this sort of thing. I think I really like the point about the souvenirs, basically, that people were making souvenirs out of people, and that's sort of where the modern photography of the day, that sort of new tech to make souvenir images of like folks, really. I think that's a good point that the author made. Do I have any question here of what do I have? Let's see. Anything else to say is a question. Yeah, and then the sort of conclusion that where in the colonized area they were still doing this to show their independence, to show their sort of like place within the capitalist structure, the colonizing structure. But then the English, they didn't care at all, because they were like, well, this is like the things we have, and so it mattered less to actually cover up the colonizer. Perhaps it was just beneficial to show, look at all the people we have because of our power. Not even people, just the servants we have, and it didn't matter. So they faded into the background as just part of like the furniture in the photographs. Yeah. Okay, so anything else to say about this? It might have been interesting to have some more of the technical things about photography, and how like these sort of things can be, like I mentioned. Oh, I didn't mention green screen. I mentioned green screen, I think in the section before, just as my internet went out. So you wonder, like nowadays you have green screens and stuff like that, so you can literally erase somebody out of a picture, and propaganda has been doing this forever with photographs. You can erase someone from a photograph. So it'd be an interesting way to have a history of erasing people, and this is one way of doing it, just covering them in drapery. Yeah. So yeah, I'm also thinking of stock photos nowadays, where they always try to insert a person of color, which like in, so there's like very white organizations, they always make sure they have like one person of color like stuck in the back. It's just like token sort of stock photo stuff they do. So there's probably an interesting history of how this sort of use of like ghost in, like the concept of a ghost in a picture, where like there's sometimes like the people modify pictures, or they put like a recurring image of like a person like that shouldn't be there, like over time, over in like different places or times, and how that sort of ghostly sort of thing has dehumanized them, and that also would play into this. So it's an interesting way of talking about being, and how the technology of photographs has played into this sort of popular imagery of ghosts, and how that also has been used in this sort of sense in terms of racial and gender oppression. Okay, that's about it for now. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties, but I'll have both videos up soon enough. If the chat has any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, that'll be it for right now, and I'll be back later. Have a good day, folks, and stay safe out there.